What's up, everybody, and welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Cayden. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, I'm joined by author, organizer, movement elder, and political handywoman Suzanne Pharr to discuss the reissue of her 1996 book, In the Time of the Right, Reflections on Liberation. It's a timely book, and I think one our listeners are going to find pretty sobering, not just because of Pharr's astute analysis, but because nearly 30 years later, so many of the same things are true. But first, of course, these headlines. On top of the charges that were brought against Newark's Mayor Ras Baraka that we talked about last week, Trump's personal legal attack dog, Alina Habba, has brought charges against 3 members of Congress, including the representative for New Jersey, District 10, LaMonica McIver, for attempting to shield Mayor Baraka from the federal agents who provoked the confrontation. What's wild, and what Natasha Leonard writes about in The Intercept this week, is that the mainstream coverage of this blatant attack against elected officials who disagree with the administration leaves out the part of the story, conveniently, where these are targeted political attacks against Black elected officials. If you just read their headlines, you'd be convinced that these officials were somehow causing the ruckus by themselves and that federal agents just moved in to respond. But if you watch the video footage from that day, you can clearly see that the agents are pursuing and provoking Baraka and other legal observers at the facility. By the way, it turns out that Habba is dropping the charges against Baraka, but claims that McIver and the other members of Congress were, quote, making federal agents unsafe, and as a result, refuses to drop the charge against them. Let's not mince our words here. This is part of a well-developed playbook for authoritarian escalation. Letting ICE and Habba and Trump off the hook in our public discourse is letting them consolidate authoritarian power. This won't be the last time we see something like this, and we have to be frank about why. Have you noticed, like me, that the blast of obnoxious noise from Elon Musk has reduced to almost zero over the past couple of weeks, and that it seems to correlate to around the same time that he spent $25 million to very loudly and publicly lose the state Supreme Court election in Wisconsin? He poked his head out of his cave this week to explain why in an interview, claiming he had, quote, done enough, and that he plans to do a lot less political spending in the future. His posts, pushed out to millions of users on his personal propaganda platform, formerly known as Twitter, have drastically shifted from constant bloviating nonsense about Trump and his destructive Doge project to focusing on his companies like Tesla and SpaceX. There are a few things that I want to note about this shift. 1, we fucking called this. If we want to impact the oligarchs, we have to go after their money. And while we don't have any smoking gun evidence, nor are we likely to, this sudden disappearance from every news cycle doesn't just happen by chance. It seems a lot more like someone's public behavior being aggressively managed by a PR firm than the pompous and allegedly ketamine-fueled outbursts that we've seen for the past year and some change. All signs suggest that his board and its majority shareholders said enough is enough and brought him to heel in response to the massive hits to Tesla stock prices and profits as a result of protests and boycotts over the past several months. 2, the nail in the coffin that finally deflated his oversized ego seems to be the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which he was happy to slap his face all over. While Wisconsinites were surely naturally appalled and sick of his behavior, the real work to drive voter turnout was, of course, driven by organizers on the ground to win that special election. And 3, and finally, and frankly most importantly, I think that it's fine to enjoy a little catharsis now and again. God knows I do. But don't believe for 1 second that we can wash our hands of Musk and the massive federal spending and bureaucracy cuts that he's already enacted. The rich are never done with politics, and Musk's damage done is not limited to his 3 months in a special government position. In a country where unlimited anonymous expenditure is considered protected free speech, the lesson that he's learned is not to stop spending, despite his claims. It's to do it more quietly, like the rest of his oligarch friends. On Wednesday night, or maybe it was Thursday morning, the House GOP jammed through a budget reconciliation package that proposes massive and catastrophic cuts to Medicaid while giving billions of dollars in tax breaks to the richest Americans. We know this stuff isn't popular, which is kind of why they had to do it in the middle of the night. And the fact that many of the very voters that sent these MAGA goons to Congress rely on Medicaid for their healthcare and their family's healthcare. A big part of this bill is also eliminating coverage of gender-affirming care for all age groups from Medicaid. And this is exactly the kind of narrative move that Jess St. Louis described on our show a few weeks ago. using attacks on transgender people as a way of justifying, excusing, and covering up cuts to public infrastructure, whether that's healthcare, as it is in this case, or public schools. It's not just an ideological line of attack. They're betting that cuts like this will make the neoliberal medicine go down with their base. But here's the thing. Voters are not stupid. Working class people are not stupid. And the tide is turning against this kind of divisive bullshit. Just yesterday, Tim Walz admitted that abandoning trans people was probably not the most strategic move in last year's election. And we now have this narrative opening to rub it in their face. Kill the reconciliation bill in the Senate and make the attack on poor and working class trans people central to the story that we tell about that. I am very excited to welcome Suzanne Pharr to the show now. Suzanne is a Southern feminist, anti-racist organizer, and one of the movement elders I've had such good fortune of learning from for many years. She's one of the most astute observers of the political project of the far right from a movement perspective, and someone whose work has spanned issue area and geography. Welcome to Block and Build, Suzanne.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here. Sorry that it's on a day right after a couple of other horrible things happening.
Oh, yesterday was rough.
Oh
news.
my goodness.
Yeah. I was actually at a strategy gathering of movement leaders from around the country yesterday, and I mean the vibes were in shambles yesterday morning. I mean people were feeling it. It was rough. So yeah. Well, to start off our conversation today, I'd love to hear a little bit about the origins of In the Time of the Right, Reflections on Liberation. Why did you write it originally in the 90s? And can you tell us a little bit, give us a little overview of the insights that you were trying to share with your readers?
Yeah. Well, it happened in 96 because I had just come off a campaign in which I had seen them make a big move. And the campaign was against queer folks. It was in Oregon, and it was called the No on 9 campaign. And they had attempted to do a legislative, movement. I mean, they had a legislative agenda, and they were trying to get this, their little idea embedded in the Constitution. So seeing that, it was like a big move on their part. I had been following them since the election of Ronald Reagan, and I talk a lot about Ronald Reagan at times.
Hard not to.
Hard not to. And Ronald Reagan and the years that followed. And I was in Arkansas following them. And so the book has a lot of references to local things happening, because it's the way I think that we learn in watching the right or watching anything build. You see what's happening in your local area, and you check out to see if it's connected to something larger, and then you begin to see this picture. And we were having far right folks, like the Posse Comitatus and the KKK and those folks in Arkansas. But then we were seeing this underlying thing that was happening, particularly among church people, and particularly among certain politicians. We could just sort of see thing after thing after thing happening that were beginning to be connected. It was something, but we also didn't take it seriously enough. This was the 80s. It's like, they're just this or they're just that. And then I went to Oregon at the request of Scott Nakagawa, and participated in that campaign. And when he showed me this little video on gay rights, special rights, and the language in that's important is special rights, that it hit me immediately. This came out of my history, that this is not about queers. This is about race. This is about the elimination of civil rights. And sure enough, that's the position a group of us took, looking at this, of what was under the surface. And the surface was, you have to get rid of these terrible people out of society in terms of teaching, in terms of participation in all kinds of things. But it was really beginning to look at the dismantling of civil rights. And so it was helpful, I think, for all of us to come to understand that this queerness was connected to race in a very bad way, in terms of the use of it as one of their wedge points, and that was one of their big strategies, was to constantly wedge people apart, divide, 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 and it's been a successful strategy. So what I wanted to do was write a book that had concrete examples in it that people anywhere could recognize from their cities or towns or wherever they lived, and that to use language that was understandable and to make it short. I think it's only a couple hundred pages and readable. Now that I was thinking, let me make this readable for, say, a 11th grader. Well, little did I know that was probably a high mark, because now they're talking about, I'm reading this in the paper these days, that the reading level is like 6th grade. And the way I know this is that it was a constitutional amendment that's they're trying to pass here, and in order to do it, they've frozen the ways that you can do a petition of voters, and said that whatever you write has to be written in the language of 6th graders. So you cannot use 3-syllable words. For example, constitution. constitutional. You got to drop that. You've got to drop that out. Well, there's our little humor for the day. And so what I attempted to do in the book is, to look back and look at the history of the right since when Goldwater lost the election in '63. That's when you began the building of it. So it's a long history. And I want to describe its methods and techniques. And I think the biggest thing I would say too, the bigger thing in terms of where it came from, is this is a feminist book. This is a book that when you read it, that you'll know it's about the way things are intersectional, and the way our lives are intersectional, and our work has to be intersectional. That it is interconnected. So I wanted to put the alarm out, even though at that time it was a growing ember. Now it is a flame, and that's from '96 to 2024 was when I did the republication of it. So it's a long journey, but I also wanted to center the book around the forces of capitalism.
Yes.
Not just the forces of resentment, not just the forces of division, but the forces of capitalism. So
yeah. Because we miss a big part of the picture of that sort of like unholy alliance, if we can call it that, if we leave capitalism out of the picture.
Yeah, I think we have to put it in the center of the picture. What motivates them and what works in motivating their following.
Yeah, and I do think that one of the things that's really valuable about the book is that you lay this out in such a like clear and straightforward way that is, you pull no punches, but also it's like not it's like, it's, to me reading it now, I'm like, oh right, like this is a thing that not to date myself, as I was 9 in 1996. But
okay.
but to think about also that this is the soup that people my age and my generation grew up in, right? Like
yes,
we came of age in a culture that was deeply like immersed in this particular combination of capitalist, patriarchal, racist, homophobic sort of like that weaving together of movements, and that like it's one of those things that's like really helps me understand in some ways, like why we are the way we are. You know, people who are my age, who are 40, you know, between like 30 and 40 years old, that like so much of our reality was shaped as we were growing up by this like coming together of these different strands of the far right, especially in the 80s and 90s. And so I find that to be incredibly useful.
Yeah, and I think this generation that you're talking about too is very vulnerable and as a target.
Mhm.
So after the time, of Reaganism, we really saw, how the economy changed, how we became international, how workers and workers' rights changed, and how people began moving around the country. And I think people felt a deep sense of the breakdown of community.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was one vulnerability, that there was not that sense of the community holding, and also not the sense of the family holding, because family members were moving around the country for jobs, or moving out of the country for jobs in some cases. And so that was a big shift. And then you add on to that the beginning of the tech generation, where communications become entirely different, and information becomes entirely different. And you begin to see that there's a larger thing. And to make it all absolutely horrible is the fact that we had COVID.
Mhm.
So you have people feeling not as tight, not as close, not as connected, and not as responsible for as they once had. Not that they were perfect before, but this is but this is a crashing of sort of societal norms and societal connections. So you find ourselves now, which we didn't have in '96, and I did not foresee this part. I saw that we were headed to something very, very hard and very
Mhm.
dark, and way bigger than people were willing to accept. I spent a lot of time answering people who are saying, "Why did you exaggerate this?" Or you know,
Seems wild now.
the kinds of things that you get when you write books like this. But
Mhm.
I just felt that people had to know that. So so you take this vulnerability that's there with our rising the movements that had risen out of the 60s. So
Mhm.
those are going side by side. And so it's a difficult situation. The movements weren't enough to hold what was happening, because
Yeah.
we weren't focusing on that kind of change. But the greater the isolation is, the easier it is to divide people.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's the link in the chain. It's those links that give you strength. And so that was big. That was big. I forgot to mention another reason I think that I came to understand authoritarianism pretty fast as I was watching it, is because I had one, because I'm a woman and I had worked in domestic violence, women's anti-violence,
Mhm.
and if there's anything that women know, we know authoritarianism.
Right.
So every woman knows that we have lived in a situation for centuries in which we receive authority from above, or not granted authority ourselves, except in minor ways. And so people always talk about the origins of authoritarianism. That is one of the origins, which is not just 2 centuries old or 3 centuries old. This is from early times of that male structure of authority. And so that was an opening coming out of the women's movement, to be able to
Mhm.
see things in certain ways. Just as now we know how to recognize a bully. We know
Yes.
a batterer when we see one. We know a person who will kill you for his wishes. So there are not very many. There must be some people who have blinders on, because some are in the administration, because they managed to find a better route of wealth and privilege. But the rest of us out here in the country, we get this. So That's always something that I keep in mind in terms of organizing. You have to speak people toward, and you have to speak to them in their experiences
Hmm. Hmm.
and in their language and those experiences of women. They're international. You know, you,
Yeah.
everywhere
Yeah.
you go,
It
you can
definitely
talk about authoritarianism.
totally, and it definitely strikes me as not coincidental that, like, a lot of the authoritarian playbook is sort of the same as, whatever you want to call it, if you want to call it Darvo, if you want to call it gaslighting, that like a lot of that playbook that authoritarian figures use on the public are very similar to what people who are engaging in domestic violence, domestic abuse use in the home, in the family.
Hmm.
That like it's like at a wildly different scale, but a lot of the stuff, I mean, even talking about this stuff with Mayor Ras Baraka and the members of Congress who went to this ICE facility, that they are being described as the instigators, as the problem, when what they're doing is frankly carrying out their civic duty to look after their
Right.
constituents. That kind of like reframing of um them in fact being targeted by by federal agents is like they're somehow instigating, it's somehow their fault, right? That like
Yeah.
that feel it, like it's not lost on me for sure that like those are kind of classic abuser tactics.
Hmm. Absolutely. Classic domination,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know. So, I mean, I don't think you can find a Black person in this country who cannot talk to you about authoritarianism. You know, the language may be different, but they understand that oppression. Working class people understand that language. You know, they understand that oppression, what it means not to have agency and to be used for your means of labor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what it was in
Yeah.
the beginning and throughout with women. We are part of the labor force, which is why we have the pronatalism movement going on now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is this is why you have no abortion. It's not
Yeah.
just that this is some sort of, oh, I want to protect the babies or I'm religious. It's no, we need those little creatures to grow up
Mm-hmm.
and to serve us. This is why we're turning our prisons into work labor places.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, this is why people understand it at some granular level. If we can use the language to talk about it in terms of the real lives of people.
Mhm, mhm, for sure. Yeah, I also think that, like, so many of the processes that we're describing are also, um they are in some ways, like, decades-long processes. Like, I've been thinking a
Hmm.
lot lately personally about, like, how we're in a moment right now where people are kind of, like, historicizing or periodizing the '90s in a real
Hmm.
way. So I feel like in a lot of ways, the, like, reissue of this book, the republication of this book feels very timely and a part of that effort to understand what the '90s really were, right?
Hmm.
Beyond like the sort of pop cultural nostalgia that I
Yeah.
think, like, the pop culture nostalgia moment sort of precedes the, like, um reckoning with what a period actually was, right? That there's like a moment where we're like, ooh, we all miss TLC, like just
we
but then but then we
we
have to
loved our
think about,
clothes.
right, or like we miss the music of the '90s, we miss the clothes of the '90s, but then there also comes a time where you have to reckon with the political culture of a time and the way that you are living in the echoes of it. And there's a number of writers and commentators who are like looking at, for instance, the militia movement and like the ways that I mean, I grew up in Michigan, and I remember being a young person, like pre-teenager, like a preteen in the '90s. Like, we knew about the Michigan militia. We didn't know what to do
Hmm.
about it. Like, I
Right.
wasn't in a
Right.
community that was engaging with that, but it was like this like low hum of something anti-government that was dark and scary and violent. Um, and I think that some of that changed a little around 9/11, right? But like
Hmm.
trying to understand the '90s politically and culturally, and the way that it has impacted the culture of our politics feels very timely right now. So yeah, I'm curious if there are other factors that prompted the desire to republish the book last year, and what the conversation kind of was around the reissue. Yeah.
Well, I had talked about it, or people had talked to me about it prior to that, and I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go through, it's a bit, I don't want to go through it. And then as I watched things unfold, it wasn't hard to see how this was going to end.
Mhm.
Uh, I've always relied on Reverend Nelson Johnson out of the Beloved Community Center for being a great thought partner with me at times. And it's like we were very clear the summer before January 6th happened that it was going to happen. We didn't know exactly in that form, but we
Sure.
knew. And so this was a point of knowing this is what we were headed for. This was that it did not look as positive as the kind of the jargon of politics was making it. Um, and just the thought, well, this is a critical time for people just to have a basic understanding of how it developed, and to be able to read that in in an easy form. And what I didn't know is that this would be as fierce and as vicious and as terrible as it has been. Um, and so all of the concerns that I can talk about later in the conversation about the way in which the movement was prepared or not prepared, um, that was also a part of maybe this could. I see it as a movement book, not as Suzanne Pharr. I've published something kind of book, but a movement book that could be used for people to get an understanding of those methods and those goals, so that you can see it as it's happening. You can take it seriously and understand how things build. You know,
Mhm.
that built, like a 50-year period to get to this point. Only in the end, it needed just the great forces that had been organized, and then a strong man
Mhm.
to lead it. And to have that person come out of the media was critically important. And so all of that coming together, but the Project 2025 provided us early, what was that in the fall, an
Mhm.
early vision of what it was going to be. And uh, all of us were appalled and astounded by that, but realized this is for real. But
Yeah.
even with that, you could not foresee a Musk if you were just out there in the general movement, trying to do your work. Um, so yeah, but many of the pieces of it, of course, we knew
Mhm.
it was going to be about immigrants. We knew they would still use trans folks as the splitting place. I mean, we know it. You know, if you don't know the gender of a person, how can you exert gender-based social control? You
Mhm.
know, it's not
Yeah.
just the scary trans people. You got to know gender so you can have that social control. Trans folks, y'all messing that up.
And I'm pleased to do so. Like, to be clear, I'm here for this.
Good, good.
You're welcome, America.
Oh my goodness. But I don't feel though. I don't feel despair, and I don't feel depression or
Mhm.
total horror all the time. Though that one's a hard one,
I
just
mean, it is
because
horrifying for sure.
that we watch the wars and we witness shock and awe, but
Mhm.
it wasn't ours. I mean, on us.
Right.
It was ours
Yeah, it
doing
was
it,
out
but not
there.
on us. And now suddenly we understand what shock and awe is about.
Mhm.
This doesn't have the blood and guts of a war, but when someone says they're taking away your access to health, we're taking away your access to food, we're
It's
taking your
not
access.
bloodless.
We're talking about dying people,
Hmm.
you know. So that effect, I think, for virtually everyone I talked to, the turning point for them was USAID,
Mm. Hmm.
which is really interesting.
It's really
In that,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, but it was this idea that after these years of trying to, follow basic tenets of living internationally with people and having concern and interconnection with them, the life-giving forces of USAID being taken away was just overwhelming to folks.
I find that very fascinating too, because I think, it's like USAID has never been a politics-less endeavor.
Hmm.
And at the same time, there is so much vital about what USAID has done in the world to, you know, support the people who are supposedly our allies that also maybe we want to control a little bit. Um, but
Keep them easy.
yeah, exactly. It's attract them to our sort of like global pole, but it does strike me that that is a direct strike at the heart of the idea of what the United States is as a global power, right? That
Right,
there's like
right.
there's a piece of um sort of the liberal like post-war consensus about like what the role of the United States is in the world,
Hmm.
that is uh that is like aimed at dismantling. And I think that like, I mean, something that maybe I would be interested in your take and tease this out a little bit is like the relationship between the sort of like isolationism of MAGA and the sense, and like there's a, again, it's like it feels like there's an echo to me of the thing that you're talking about, individual isolation, and then this global isolation, right? That there's
Hmm.
like an
Hmm.
isolation from the international community. Yeah, I'm curious what you think, what your thoughts are about that, and like how you see that sort of, because it's both a material question about trade, about industry, about these like big sort of like economic questions, but it is also a sort of like cultural and um discursive question, right? About like what it means to be like in a broader community of like people on the planet, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that like we as the left, like we as social movements are currently struggling with how we think and talk about the United States' role in the world, and how that can shape our politics.
I think isolationism is at the heart of what we're talking about, whereas collectivity is at the heart of the kind of freedom and humanitarian ways that we want to live. So I think isolationism is necessary for you to be a dictator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't be linked up to other countries because then you're having to have, sort of some kind of common interest, some sort of common uh, issues and resolution of those issues. You, isolationism is moving always toward I can hit you with a hammer, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and I have the force behind me. I have the force of money. I have the force of guns. I have the force of you know the bombs that can be dropped on you. But I think it's just this very much a central part of of authoritarianism. So and we move closer to it all the time. I'm going to go back to with that to USAID, in that I think the other reason that people were so struck by it hit at the same time we have so many damaged and dying people in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
When the one place where people seem to, even those who seem to unable to, seem to find some emotion is with that idea of so many children and babies killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think USAID sort of stood for, this is the way you get food into a country like that. This is the way you get medical support into a country like that. This is the way you get uh, medicine for HIV into a country. That allowing us in the midst of our domination to feel like we were still good people.
Mm-hmm.
And that taking it away, dropped that possibility of us representing ourselves as. So when you have that upper middle class person going to Europe or going to the Middle East, they can say, well, I know America does these bad things, but we also take care of people. We do have good in our hearts. We are, you know. So, and that to me is a really important kind of idea to think of. Why the USAID means so much to people, and I think it's multi-layered.
Yeah.
I think I would not damn all U.S. citizens. I think we have plenty of people who who have great hearts and great compassion and are struggling in a very hard environment to have it. You know, that they're pushed hard in that area because the possibilities of need grow greater every day, and our capacity to meet those needs is harder. And
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with everything. It has to do with the economy. It has to do with wars. It has to, name
Yeah.
everything.
Climate
But
change, you name it.
yeah, it's in our daily lives. So I want to go back. This leads me to something I wanted to talk about if I
Yeah.
can. Just jump on a subject here, but back to this idea of isolation and
Mm-hmm.
separation and the damage it has done to us. It's been a tremendous damage to our movement, especially the movement that's housed in nonprofits,
Yes.
because the right could only rise by finding cracks to move
Mm-hmm.
through. Because we had extraordinary movements coming out of the 60s, coming out of the 70s, coming out of the 80s. I think of not just the civil rights movement. I think of the uh, people with disabilities. That whole movement of looking for a victory, and had a great victory. Civil rights had great victories. I think ACT UP and
Mm-hmm.
the whole queer movement had great victories, and I think we should be really proud of those. But I think also during this time, we did not listen to what was formative for my adult life, which was the Combahee River collective statement of this idea that we are more than just one thing. That is
Yeah.
that that is there are many aspects to who we are, and we have to see people. We have to see people in that way, and we have to work in that way. But we went more and more to, sort of singular politics of one group of people who's suffering this thing, which makes it hard. It had to be proved that it's much more terrible than what somebody else did. The identity politics kind of thing. So that you have to do that in part in order to, is that we thought to get our people, but also to get the money.
Yeah.
You have to. So the competition among both identity and just among nonprofits in general over money has been pretty disastrous for us, and it's corporatized us. I mean, we look more like those within the nonprofit sector, looking at more like little businesses, you know, or in some of them big business, especially when
Some of
a
them
lot of
very big businesses.
when a lot of money dropped in the last 5 years. That shifted. And so you combine that, with not being interconnected and doing, singular identity politics, being highly competitive, being structured like a business, and you add not being able to be in each other's physical presence. You know, how do you have a movement community?
Mm.
And that is a terrifically uh, important thing, to have that some sense of connected. We need to at least be looking in the same directive, or we need to maybe go many, many different ways, but to the same goal, you know, not the same little victory, but the same overall goal. And I think we have to work that out. I think we have to totally rethink nonprofit organizations and
Mhm.
everything from what is the power of the funder, what is the power of an organization that's built like an A-frame, where the
Yep.
power is at the top, and what does it mean to be paying people far more money than the people that they are working to to build into agency of their own. There's just so many issues in that I mean, I think it's time to call for another. The revolution will not be funded, and and to hold that conversation in a big public way, because if we 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 did some things toward this all, but we
Mhm.
did not pay attention to it enough and directly fight this. It was only after September 11th that people began to wake up and say, "Oh my God, there's something out there, and it's got some control in the government, and it's moving in this way, and we got to move." So we're like 40 years behind. No,
Yeah.
not 40, but a lot, a lot behind. So I worry about that. I don't see the places where we're having that conversation, and it seems to me that it's, it's not a problem that's too big to solve. I think it's
Yeah.
a solvable problem.
Well, let me try to weave some threads together here, because it's interesting that there are a number of movement elders that I've spoken with very recently. Like in the last couple months, Linda Burnham said something very much to this effect to me as well. So
Hmm.
there's
Another,
there's there's
another
some
feminist.
threads out there. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
And I think also that one thing that occurred to me very early in my career as somebody who has made my living, like is able to put food on the table and a roof over my head by working for organizations that are 501(c)(3s, is like, why, on some level I'm like, yes, I really like having employer paid health insurance, because like, geez,
Oh
it's great.
yeah, and,
And on
and
another
you
level,
and you
I'm
should.
yeah, and like,
Mhm.
there are a lot of structural shifts that we could make in this country that would also change the material conditions of folks who are doing the work within these organizations, that would like change the dynamics within them too, right? Like whether that's universal basic income, single payer healthcare, whatever. And also like, um there's also a piece of this to me that is about like, uh the thing that happens when you are a funded organization, that like your goal then becomes to continue to like reproduce the organization year over year, as opposed to being like, what is our long-term agenda? Right? That's like, directive 1 might be the mission that's on the website, but directive 0 is like, we need to continue to employ our people, which like I would like to, right? Like I think it's important that we have folks who are thinking about these questions full time, and putting that time in. Um, and I think that like, a lot of the competition stems from not just the dynamic with funders, but also the sense that if these are our full-time jobs, we want to have jobs next year too, right? Like we want to have jobs
Mm.
the year after that. That there's a really like complex interplay of the way the economy has shifted, um, with the sort of like just like complete dominance of neoliberalism, um
Mhm. Yep.
and also I think, yeah, it feels so like messy and complicated to me to think about like, how do we pull these things apart. And also I think that like, one of the things that strikes me about the Reflections on Liberation chapter is how focused you are on the way that we need to be building together. Because like when I wear the hat that's like, I run Convergence, which is a publication, which is also, it is also kind of a business. I mean, we
Mhm.
do have a product, right? that people are increasingly willing to pay us for as well. That you know, there's that hat, and then there's the hat of like Cayden, the guy who like lives in Oakland, who like has relationships with people, who has friendships, who has comradeships, and that like I don't know, it's very hard to untangle these threads to me. And it's something that like I struggle with also,
Mm,
you know, that
yeah.
like, and that a lot of my friendships are also relationships that I built in this like professionalized nonprofit like work environment, which is also complicated.
Well, I think is the professionalization is an issue.
Yeah.
All Most people I know in the movement talk really big about issues of economic injustice,
Hmm.
but don't work with people who experience economic injustice and do not hire them. They mostly hire graduates of universities
Hmm.
and good universities. So you have a movement that's talking about the working class, but not living among and working directly with the working class. And that is a huge critical issue because these conversations about the professionalization come down mostly to talking about whether people should be paid a lot or not. It's, the question is, how can we do this work and get people to be able to change their lives, be able to work with people to enable this changing of their lives that they are fully engaged with. So we're not doing training to that level, and
Hmm.
we're not so we have a lot of people who are being hired just for very specific uh, responsibilities, but not have not done experience the political education that you need to understand why it's important to be related with the people that you are supposedly standing with and for, and also people do not have, uh, in particular, organizing training.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everybody calls themselves organizers, but ain't true. Just because you put a party together, there might be a little bit
Yes,
of organizing,
that does not an organizer make. No.
but organizing in the deepest sense is not that. And so I think all of that is something that can be taken care of. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just one of the things that we need to do. We need to find this way that we can move forward, not doing the same thing by any means, not carrying the same politics, but toward an end goal
Yes.
that has collective acceptance. So, I mean, when I look out there, I think what will save us? Okay, because this point, that's my language, using the word save. What will save us? Because many days it looks like, oh my God, so many people are standing in front of a certain kind of, maybe they're all different, but a certain kind of firing squad, whether it's the loss of their money, their homes, whether it's the loss of food, uh, whatever it is that makes you able to survive in this world. That people are facing that. But I think it would be collectivity
Mm.
on every level.
Hmm.
So that means we have to figure out how to be part of community, how to make community, how to build community. Um, there was a lot of push and important conversation after COVID about mutual aid.
Yeah.
Out of that, I think people maybe learned a lot about community and maybe a lot about that it's not you don't bring about strength by doing for people. You bring about strength by doing with people. That's where we needed a lot of organizing training and how to have that in movement. I think the other thing that people have, and people have deep desire for community because they feel this split. We all
Yeah.
do everywhere.
Well, it's
And
evolutionary on some level. Like
yeah,
we are not designed to be isolated as like a
that's right.
species.
But that was broken. It
Hmm.
was broken both by the internet and by COVID. And so it's a matter of, how to move that. And then I believe strongly we have to redefine family. I've been saying this for a
Yeah.
decade or two.
Hmm.
And I think there would be people begin to understand what there is that we hold that we can call family and how we can rely on that and depend on that. So it's community and then those smaller pieces which are family. And I think we can figure out how to do that. We can do that. People do it now,
Hmm.
but we haven't talked about it enough as movement work,
Yeah.
as an example of what we can do. And then finally, clearly you can tell I could talk all day long. I've been thinking a lot, what could be a common goal? What is that possible? And I'm taken with this idea that maybe what we could believe in common is the International Bill of Human Rights. And I don't know if you've ever read it, but it basically covers everything that we talk about. It holds within it high principles. So when you think about that bill, it was it, it came at the end of the Second World War.
Hmm.
So here they sit down after 60,000 to 80,000 people have died, and most of those were civilians. And they write this bill, and it's put into effect in 48. But I think what we could get it to be is that we could fortify our humanity with it. It holds those very humane things, and so it would be a matter of getting it where it's followed.
Hmm.
So there's a move that we would have to make, but just something in terms of theory and practice and belief, that would be one thing I think would be absolutely common ground is that bill. If we spent some time thinking about it, how it, how it could be used and how it could be brought to the point where nations actually have to follow it, you know.
Yeah,
But
and
it's
that
lacking
people are.
it's lacking that one piece.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's implicit in that to me is also this question of accountability.
Yeah.
Like, how are we accountable to one another? Um,
Hmm.
and I think that like the other thing that the culture of neoliberalism has done to us
Hmm.
is thinking that the way that we are accountable to one another is by basically paying each other money.
That's right. that's pretty.
And like
That's pretty sad.
that's the only way I feel we know how, like, culturally, that like the mainstream culture has taught us that we uh just like apologize, that we take responsibility for things, and we do that by paying money to the public, to somebody we've wronged, whatever that is. And I think that like there's this feels connected to the like nonprofitization thing,
Yeah.
right? That like
Right.
there's kind of a lie about that
Hmm.
circulates in society, and that like philanthropy is frankly part of that lie, right? Like
Yeah.
philanthropy, the part of the point of philanthropy is it's like, oh, we've amassed this enormous amount of wealth, and our sort of like noblesse oblige is to give it out.
Right.
Um, and that is actually an evasion of accountability, as opposed to it's like a performative evasion of accountability as opposed to actual accountability.
So what if, as a movement, we could get that Bill of Rights to be legally binding, which it's not now. It's not legally binding. And what if it were? What if it were around the world legally binding? I mean, you could do things as part of the work on that, or looking toward the one. You could just use it a frame for
Mhm.
all that you do, because virtually everything we believe in is listed in that. But you could have like um, human rights boards where within a community you could look at what seems to be violations of human rights in that community, and you could raise that up. That would be just one of the small things that you can move towards. Sort of like they have those community boards in San Francisco that you probably know about, where they
Mhm.
do mediation. It's like taking this stuff that's resting over here in somebody else's hands, is not going well, and putting it in the movement's hands. of working it in a different way. But I think human rights boards, you could actually point out over and over. And so you say, well, what does it mean to just point it out? I think it means an incredible amount to have awareness brought up all the time, because I think we have to nurture our humanity. It can slip. We can slip to the point where we are not we're not the caring human beings that we should be. It needs to be nurtured by. This is why I put a lot about in the end of the book about cultural work, because I think that's one of the ways the message is carried. That does through the feeling that you have when you hear those songs. Whatever those songs are, that links you to other people, moves us toward that being able to, strengthen that sense of being more humane and more connected and more having more ability to stand up and stop what is horror and your block and build those parallel organizations, particularly build those parallel and in opposition ways to live that represent that humane self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that resonates for me also, that like there's a way in which we've been separated from our humanity. It's not just that we've lost it. It's actually that
That's right. That's right.
It's sometimes been wrested from our hands, like as we kick and scream against it. And that figuring out ways to claw it back and to be like, this is who I am and who I would like to be in the world is I mean, I think it's I think a lot of the reason that people come to social movements in the first place is because they are feeling that lack, and that like the challenge is about how do we hold that process. And I think that like a lot of the stories and the reflections on Liberation chapter where you talk about people that you have known and that your own process of finding belonging in movement is deeply instructive in that sense.
I find great hope in our having a generation now that really cries out, we will not watch people die on the ground. We will not watch babies be killed. We will not honor this country for doing that. People have lots of talk about generational differences, but virtually every young generation that comes along has some sense of I want to make change. And this one, I think, is seriously connected to we will not, we will not honor a country that does this, that we're standing on the ground of.
Yeah. And people are putting stuff on the line for it too.
Yes.
It's not just talk. Yeah.
And taking chances.
Yeah. Suzanne, it's almost a delight to talk to you.
Great. It's big fun. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm also like, I have like 50 more questions and we could talk for like the rest of the day, probably.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you talking about In the Time of the Right. And I do want to make sure that people know that this is not a marketed book, that you can download it from my website, which is SuzannePharr.com. I mean, it can be bought through Amazon, but that's because the university that did it for free they have a contract with them. But the book itself is totally available. It's in the Commons.
And there's a discussion guide that's like a new discussion guide. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. New introduction. Yeah. You've got to, if we're going to do something about this capitalism that we're living in, we've got to do things like get our information in the Commons.
Yeah. And meet people where they are with that information. So thank you for coming on the pod. And I hope this is a vehicle by which more people are like, oh, I should read this book. Because we need it.
Right. We need everything we get, and people are putting out great information. There's a world of it, and you're one of them. So
Oh, thanks,
thank
Suzanne.
you for that.
Always a delight. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
You bet.
My thanks again to Suzanne Pharr for joining us today. The second edition of In the Time of the Right, Reflections on Liberation is available for free, as she mentioned, for download on her website, suzannepharr.com. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. You can also buy a paperback copy there as well if you want to hold a physical book in your hands, which sometimes I do. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Cayden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art. If you have something to say, please drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And finally, if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.